Welcome to BWConversations. It has been estimated that cybercrime will cost the world $10 trillion annually by 2025. Today we speak to Rohit Mahajan, President, Risk Advisory, Deloitte, about how governments, organizations, and even individuals can save themselves from cyber attacks. Welcome, Mr. Mahajan. So my first question, since it's been reported that the world will lose somewhere around $10 trillion annually by 2025, I just want to get a sense of how much loss has there been from cybercrime in, say, 2019, 2020? If you can give our viewers a little bit of an estimate there.
Yeah, I think before I actually get into specifics on what is the extent of loss, I think I'll just set some context in terms of cyber, because it's definitely an area which is significantly being discussed, and for the right reasons. Now, one of the things which is very clear, especially from a corporate environment standpoint, organizations today, are no more thinking about if a cyber attack happens. I think the belief is it is more with respect to when will it happen. So there is vulnerability across the board, and I will tell you with my experience how I have seen things evolving is, and obviously, as we go along, things do change and improve. More often than not, when you look at it from a larger time scale, prevention has always followed the incident, right? So when you talk about being proactive and securing yourself, when you look at most of the preventive measures which we've identified and organizations are taking, they were actually identified post an incident had happened. So I would, possibly I would not be wrong saying that, look, today the hackers are much more proactive than a lot of organizations who are developing the preventive measures. Having said that, now coming to the point of what is the extent of impact of cyber? I think, it's a difficult question to answer, but I know you've thrown a number at me and I will respond to you with a number. But if you look at it, a cyber attack can be a mere inconvenience, or it can actually put the entire existence of an organization to risk. So that's the kind of impact cyber can have. And when I look at it from an India standpoint, my understanding is from an India context, as some of the stats speak about it, cyber crimes in India have actually caused losses of over 1.25 crore in 2019. That is pre-pandemic. And the belief is post-pandemic, the impact has gone up by 35%. So you can imagine and understand the kind of scale and the impact which possibly India as a country could have experienced, not specifically in the corporate sector, but on an overall basis, because of cyber, I would say cyber risk.
So you just said that post-COVID, so do you say that because of COVID, there has been an increase in such, attacks and such instances? And also, what is the reason for that?
A very relevant question in today's time. We are living in a COVID environment, or I would say in a pandemic environment. And, it does appear that hackers are actually upping the game, and they are trying to capitalize, on the new shift which the companies are trying to take, especially with respect to work from home. So when I look at it from a hacker's point of view, the focus is to develop new malware to attack and infiltrate systems. I think that's the key and prime objective of a hacker. So as I mentioned, prior to the pandemic, cyber attacks, possibly around 20% of the cyber attacks, we were experiencing almost around 20% increase in cyber attacks year on year. During the pandemic, I think the percentage has gone up to 35%. There are new attacks in the form of, let's say, whether it's machine learning that actually adapts to the environments and significantly remains undetected. I'll give you an example, and I'm sure a lot of us would have experiences. There are phishing attacks which are becoming much more sophisticated using different channels. Today, it's not only emails, it's also through SMSs and voice. So the voice one, they're branding it as phishing, right? So there are new avenues which are being identified to infiltrate, to penetrate systems. Now, the interesting part is, and especially in the last 1 year, there has been so much of discussion, information sharing on vaccine and vaccine development that in itself is being used in phishing campaigns. Right? I've seen it. I've talked to a lot of people who've experienced it. So I think all those vulnerabilities are being identified in a very proactive manner to infiltrate and penetrate systems. In fact, ransomwares are also becoming much more sophisticated. For example, hackers are combining data leakage attacks with ransoms to persuade victims to pay up, pay ransoms. So I would say the upsurge in the sophisticated cyber attacks genuinely calls for some real cutting edge detection mechanisms, and I would say more proactive detection mechanisms to really manage the threat. And there is a new area where a lot of organizations are investing significantly. I think it's globally happening. They are looking at analytics, and analytics more in terms of a user behavioral analytics, which is being looked at to really identify and understand abnormalities in the behavior and conducts of users to figure out if there are deviations. Do we run a risk of cyber? I think those are the kind of new tools and technologies which are coming in today's environment to really try to mitigate the risk of cyber. And as I said, during pandemic, the more we move digital, the more there is work from home, right? It actually opens significant avenues of penetration for smart cyber attacks.
So I want to understand from you, who is vulnerable? Is there some formula for people, organizations that are vulnerable? What is it that the hackers are looking out for? And also I want to understand from you, what are the best practices? What can we do at an individual level, at an organizational level? How can organizations and governments and individuals protect ourselves from?
So I think when you ask me who is vulnerable, my response to that is everyone is vulnerable, right? And when I look at from a corporate environment, whether it's small and medium enterprises, it's healthcare institutions, government agencies, energy companies, right? Everyone is vulnerable. Right, wherever there is technology play, the risk of cyber goes up. That's wherever there is data which is being secured or stored digitally, the risk of cyber attack goes up. So I would summarize it saying that everyone is vulnerable, and in terms of and it's regardless of the size. So as I said, whether it's small, medium, large corporations, irrespective. So everyone is vulnerable. You and I are vulnerable if we are securing a lot of information, let's say on a hand phone or mobile phone, right? And a lot of people do that, right? Whether it's passwords, bank account details, numbers, etc., right? We ourselves, our handheld devices are also vulnerable because they are all technology enabled. Now that's because I think today, what is it that we need to do to mitigate, the risk of fraud? And before I actually get into what is it that we need to do to mitigate the risk of fraud, it's very important to also understand, what are the kind of security threats or cyber security threats which we could face in coming times. And especially, and why I say that is because today in the environment, these are the things which I'm going to mention, are very regularly mentioned and talked about, whether it's cloud, whether it's artificial intelligence, whether it's machine learning, and I've mentioned machine learning in my first comment itself, whether it's social engineering and the social media, so much of discussion happening around that. People are using a lot of applications and tools to Photoshop images. They call it deep fake, right? Anything and everything we do, wherever there is a technology intervention, right, there is a risk of cyber threat. So I think that's in terms of how I would look at a cyber threat. Now, in terms of what is it that the organizations need to do to mitigate the risk of fraud, I think the starting point is, first of all, the organizations need to accept that there is a cyber risk. Very, very fundamental thing, right? More often than not, when I turn back the clock a couple of years back, cyber was a risk, right? But was it a boardroom discussion? It was not a boardroom discussion, right? Today, Cyber has been identified as a strategic risk, as I mentioned, which could threaten the existence of an organization. And organizations need to accept the fact that they need to have a game plan in terms of how do they mitigate the risk, right? It can't be that someone somewhere in the organization is managing the risk. I think the accountability needs to go up the value chain right to the top. I mean, that's very, very important. So to start with, I think there needs to be, a cyber security framework. Every organization needs to have a very evolved, defined, and a dynamic framework. When I say dynamic, because things are changing so fast, right? We need to keep pace with those changes. Otherwise, anything and everything we create as a framework becomes obsolete. And the interesting part is the more it becomes obsolete, the more you get exposed to risk. And I will give you an example. There are a lot of organizations who still have legacy systems, right? Which actually got implemented possibly a decade back or so. And they're still leveraging and using those legacy systems to run businesses. Now, those are very, very vulnerable areas. So frameworks need to be created, right, for security, cyber security, and those frameworks need to be dynamic. It needs to be changing with times, and companies need to continue investing in upgrading their technology. Very, very important. I think also a cyber attack or a cyber risk needs to become more holistic at an enterprise level. It can't be, because cyber risk is no more a technology risk. Earlier, cyber risk was attached to being a technology risk. A chief technology officer was responsible for it. It was his or her responsibility to ensure that there is mitigate the risk. But today, cyber is no more a technology risk. Cyber is actually an enterprise-wide risk. So it has to be looked at from an entire organization standpoint, right? Every aspect of what we do in the business is exposed to cyber if there is technology intervention. And today, we're talking about Industry 4.0, manufacturing. There's going to be a huge amount of investment on IoT, OT. Everything becomes vulnerable. Everything becomes vulnerable. So we need to look at cyber as a enterprise level risk. The third thing, I think we also need to identify what is key for us. What are the crown jewels, or what are the key assets which we need to secure at any cost? I think, that's something which organizations have started doing. And there has been a lot of discussions, even at board levels, in terms of what do we believe as an organization are our key assets or our crown jewels, and where the risk is significantly high, and what kind of governance mechanisms we need to put in place. The other thing which I personally believe organizations need to do, they need to invest in cyber talent, right? And when I say cyber talent, it's very important that there are individuals in the organization who understand cyber, right? Who understand the risk of cyber, and who are thinking what can go wrong. What is it that we'll end up doing which could expose up to a cyber risk? So it's very important that there is a machinery which is working within the organization, which is thinking cyber risk. And why I say that is, look, I have a background where I used to lead forensic. I've done a lot of fraud investigations, and one of the recommendations and suggestions which I used to give a lot of my clients was that you need to have someone who's thinking fraud. And when I say fraud, in terms of what can go wrong, which could expose the organization to fraud. Till the time you don't do that, there are others who are doing it who land up committing a fraud in the company. So you need to be ahead of the race. So the organizations need to invest in building cyber talent and defining the role in terms of how they can secure the organization, how they can think ahead, how they can ensure preventive measures are more proactive than reactive. Very, very important. And I think there has to be a very, very inclusive and exhaustive reporting and review mechanism. The boards need to take accountability from a governance standpoint. They need to, have a reporting and updating structure where on a regular basis, both in terms of preparedness, both in terms of resilience, there is enough information being provided. So at the end of the day, when it's coming from the board, there is a level of seriousness about the risk which organizations possibly could be exposed to from a cyber standpoint. That would also ensure that the organization at a larger level is thinking cyber, investing in areas where they believe, they need to protect assets and valuables of the organization, and especially data to start with. I think that becomes an important parcel of the entire ecosystem of how the organizations operate.
Now, I'm going to change track a little bit because there's certain things I'm curious about, and I just want to know. There are these platforms that have encrypted conversations, for instance, where they say it's end-to-end encrypted. There are a lot of those like that nowadays. So I want to understand from you, are those also vulnerable? Do those things have vulnerabilities in them, those kind of platforms?
A difficult question, to be very honest. But you also need to understand, encryption is a mode of protection,
okay,
right? Or process of protection. It totally depends upon the user also, in terms of how you secure and manage your information. I'll give you an example today, and these are basic examples I'll give you, which we face on a day-to-day lives. One of the things which is recommended and suggested is to have strong passwords. I can bet my bottom dollar 80% of the population will not put strong passwords. We will put names of our children, birthdays, etc., which are very simplistic passwords from a hacker's point of view, right? So that is one, because once you do not put strong passwords to protect your data, the risk of penetration goes up. Second of all, the other thing which makes anything and everything vulnerable is with respect to how often do we upgrade our software. There are these these pop-ups which keep coming of upgrading your operating system. More often than not, we ignore it, right? That in itself is a risk, because those upgrades have patches which help you protect your equipment, your systems. When we don't upgrade it, they become obsolete, right? That means they're vulnerable. There is a threat of penetration into your system. So I think these are important aspects. So it's not about encryption, securing you. It's also about your responsibility and your diligence, which you need to do to ensure that you keep your equipment and systems updated, which newer patches, newer technologies to mitigate the risk of fraud. And as I mentioned earlier, the hackers are more proactive when it comes to really trying to get into your system, and we are more reactive when it comes to trying to secure our system.
Right. So basically, what you're saying is that just like organizations, even individuals need to follow best practices, and we need to ensure that we're protected. So
absolutely.
So this is good. This has been very helpful and very informative. And thank you so much for sparing time to go.
Thanks.